Victor Davis Hanson, welcome. You're talking to John O'Sullivan, the president of the Danube Institute here in Budapest, and this is the latest of our Danube Dialogues, which we've been doing really since the lockdown started. Now, obviously, we are going to talk about a number of things, but I'd like to begin with your earlier life. Now, we'll be saying, I will not be listing all of the decorations and experiences, professorships and academic posts you've had. We'll be putting those up on the screen later. But I think it's fair to say that you're both a distinguished academic, a classicist, a historian, a novelist, but also a working farmer on a family farm. And I think that probably distinguishes you from most academics in the United States, and it certainly distinguishes you from most academics in Europe today. So do you think the fact that you have been and are a farmer has added a kind of a depth and a difference to the work you do, distinguishing it from those of your colleagues in academia?
I think it has. When I try to think of things, I don't try to look at them as perfect or awful, but what's better than the alternative. And that was valuable when I didn't approve of Trump all that much in the primary, but compared to the alternative as practical matter. And that comes from, he was preferable by far. And I think that comes from the idea that you're never going to get a perfect plum crop. I never got a perfect raisin crop. I never was able to get a perfect peach harvest, but you do all the things that you can to get it good enough to survive one more year. So that's practical. And then you have a sense of continuity. I'm living in the house here behind me that I was born at, and I'm the sixth generation to live here. It was built in 1870 by my great-great-grandmother out here in Central California, and there's an idea that you each have a duty to continue a tradition, and that carries over to your view of politics, culture, and society, that we all have local customs and traditions without which the civilization can't continue. And I think that's something that's very important and in peril right now.
I think the other thing true about such lives is that you are also meeting a lot of people on a regular basis. You know them as old friends, family connections, who have nothing to do with academia and who have a very different, like to some extent, different outlooks. And that too surely is an important element, I think, in a full life.
I'd say so. I think most of the people I see here that I'll see today and that I saw tomorrow, because we're in a kind of a lockdown. I haven't been to the Stanford campus. They won't let us go to our offices where I commute and have an apartment. But I'd say that 9 out of 10 people I've seen don't have a bachelor's degree the last 90 days that I grew up with. And they're very bright people. They're very capable people, truckers, mechanics, clerks. I just talked to a local highway patrolman I know very well who comes by. And your degrees or what you've written they're just oblivious. Nobody cares. So you're judged about how you talk and what you do and how you treat people. And there's no hierarchies. Hierarchies can be good, but it's good to be in places where hierarchies are natural. In other words, you're judged as deserving respect or not by the way you conduct yourself and not what your resume say. I think that's the problem with a lot of academics. They have a certain sense that their past accomplishments are, first of all, much more important in their own mind than they are in others. And then second, that they can make an argument from authority rather than from reason or logic.
Actually, just before we came on screen, I saw a program from New York, news program, something happening just now, in which a young woman claiming to be highly educated is addressing the cops who are keeping order on the edge of this sort of no-go area that's been established by the semi-revolutionaries, denouncing the cops as uneducated, stupid, don't even have a college, even a college degree, so to speak, a non-college degree, and sneering at them. Now, I think I probably don't need to ask you what you think of that, but what do you think that kind of thing is having what kind of impression is that making on most people watching the programs?
Yeah, I think there's two impressions. The most obvious is that there's a stereotype that the Antifa and Antifa affiliated and the college educated protesters are pampered upper middle class. So that generation has $1.6 trillion in aggregate student debt. And I think that's a lot of it because they're not marrying, they're not having children, they're not buying homes, and their sort of life of Julia pajama boy, prolonged adolescence. And then they get very angry and they talk in a certain way. Their diction, their tone, it turns people off. And so most Americans sympathize with the cops, both black and white, who are being yelled at by these people. The second thing is, I think some people realize the reasons that civilizations have police is not just to protect us from barbarism, but to protect the barbarians from us. And by that I mean, if they do defund the police, and people like the woman that you're referencing goes around getting in people's face and doing things, there will be a reaction, and it will be a vigilante or an unlawful reaction. So traditionally throughout classical cultures, the rise of a state monopoly on force was designed to stop tribal feuding, blood feuding, vigilantism. And I think the left doesn't understand that. They want to get rid of the police, and then they think they'll be in control. But when they start doing these things, and we saw that yesterday in St. Louis with a man and his wife that were armed and went out in their lawn and said, we're going to prevent you from going into our home. And they would have, and a lot of people in the protest may have been hurt. So I think the left has forgotten that. The police protect them from the natural reaction to them.
I will just ask another question about farming. The economist J.K. Galbraith came, I think, from a Canadian rural background, had worked on the farm, and he said that having done so, no other work ever really seemed like work again. Do you think that's true, and do you think that it's, in a sense, explains in part at least your productivity, which is enormous?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's the one thing that combines your muscles and your mind. And there's a big difference. I spent most of my summers, because our farm wasn't big enough to support all of us. I had cousins and brothers, so a lot of us worked on other farms. So when you're going up and down pruning or thinning, tree after tree, or picking, and as you're doing something for somebody else, then it can become rote labor. But when you're doing it for yourself, and you're thinking and you're looking at each individual vine or each individual tree as you prune it or you pick it, and you analyze what you did right and wrong, it's a different experience. It's almost sort of like cutting the hair off some dog that you don't know versus trimming your own dog. And that's a big difference. And so when I was farming, and I'm 66, so I don't get out there as much, but when I'm working on my own place and doing for myself and my family and for people who are going to follow me, it doesn't seem like work at all. And it's a very strange thing where you can think and use your muscles. Yeah. And that the Greeks were very cognizant of that, with this idea of balance, or what they call tomason, that just muscular labor could be brutish and just intellectual thinking could be a feat. So they tried to combine the two.
Well, both your parents were highly educated people, and your siblings have gone into other aspects of academic life. I was wondering why it was you went particularly into classical scholarship and really have developed other people's interest in classical scholarship in America and elsewhere to a very great extent.
Well, I was very lucky that I lived on a farm with my grandfather, never went to college, and he had 3 daughters, and he mortgaged his farm in the 1930s and 40s and sent 2 of them to Stanford. One was crippled from polio, and she wasn't able to finish, but she went to San Jose Industrial College. So all 3 of them were educated because he didn't have any boys, and he thought, I'm going to need bright, independent women. So, and my father was kind of a football war hero, but he did get a master's degree as well. And so then they came back, and in this very isolated place. So I was always encouraged to read and to leave the farm for a while, but always to come back. And then the other thing is, very quickly, classics became for me a refuge. And by that I mean I had brothers who were very athletic and they were very bright, but I tended to be, I was the only one in my family who was left-handed. I wore glasses, and they thought I was not quite a partier. I wasn't as social, and maybe that was part of it. But by the time I got to college, I met some very good professors, and they said, if you're pretty good in Greek and Latin. The first time I took them, I was 18, and if you wanted to continue, you could pay your entire graduate school. And so for me, as I kept getting drawn into it, what I didn't realize at the age of 26 when I had a PhD, it was sort of, I was pretty good in languages. The degrees were not in history or archaeology, but classical philology, and that included things like, as you know from English education, Greek and Latin composition. So I had a smart-ass brother who said to me, being able to write in Latin and Greek is sort of like a dog that can dance on its hind legs. We're surprised that it happens, but we don't know the purpose of it. And I don't know if he got that quote from somebody. So I didn't know. So I didn't use that education. I farmed for 5 years, and then I went to a local university that was 30 miles away from where I'm speaking, Cal State, Fresno. I started. They had no classics program, and they didn't really want me. And I taught some Latin, and then next thing I knew, some people entrusted a position to me, and then I spent 21 years there teaching mostly poor Mexican and Southeast Asian kids and the diaspora of the Oklahoma Dust Bowl, Latin and Greek, and then I retired at 50, and we had 6 professors, so it was a very good program.
Well, we think, when we're talking about the classics, we think of the Greeks and the Romans and the Israelites as being sources of our own civilization. They helped shape it. And I wonder about how that works. When you read a dialogue with Plato, or a comedy by Aristophanes, or a speech of Cicero's, do you feel that we in our civilization are in the same traditions, in a way that's not true for other civilizations, the Indian one, for example, or the Chinese? In what sense are they, the people in the past, Plato, Cicero, and the others, what sense are they us today?
I think the big difference in Western humane studies and Greece and Rome in particular is this idea of self-criticism or self-awareness or a critical consciousness. And by that I mean a play of, say, take Lysistrata is immediately attacking the idea that women might not have as good ideas about this disastrous Peloponnesian War as men. Or Antigone has the moral high ground over Creon in Sophocles' play. Or in Agamemnon, this sort of deep in the Iliad, Agamemnon and Menelaus are sort of the deep state. And they have powers that they really don't deserve, but they got them through their authority or their lineage, as opposed to Achilles, who's a meritocratic outlier. And so what I'm getting at is, in all of this literature, there is a sense that the author is looking at the world. I could get into Plato and Aristotle, but it would take all day. And then they're trying to tear it apart, and they're trying to analyze it, and they're trying to do it, though, within acceptable parameters. By that I mean they understand grammar and diction and genre. So if there's if they're Plato, it's going to be in a dialogue, and that's going to be an accepted genre. If it's Aristophanes, it's going to be about 1,200 lines. There's going to be choruses, catabasis, all that. If it's going to be a Sophoclean or Aeschylean play, there's going to be about 4 choruses and 2 or 3 characters. And all of these will be in meter, whether they're iambic pentameter or trochees, or in the case of epic, dactylic hexameter. So what I'm getting at is you get into a genre and you feel comfortable with it, and yet it's going to be new. So it's both reassuring, but it's also exciting. I think part of the problem is when we pick up a poem today or a history or we have no idea what to expect. There are no rules. There is no accepted grammar anymore, or diction, or you can see the F word, the S word, you can see anything in print, and it's jarring, whereas they thought their ideas should be jarring. I think our problem in the modern world is our ideas are trite or conventional, or they're stereotypical, and the genre doesn't exist. So that's been, I think, my biggest pleasure in reading classics, that they're so self-critical. The other final thing is they don't seem to self-censor themselves. I think in the modern world, and at times in the West, especially during the Reformation or Counter-Reformation, even during the Renaissance, people said things and they worded them in certain ways for an effect on an audience. All authors do that, but in the ancient world, there's a sense that you want to capture reality and other people will say, yes, that's right. And then you're not going to self-censor yourself. So even Cicero, who ended up getting killed, and who was very mindful of the effect of his words and the political situation and his own safety, was pretty much unbridled. If you read his Philippics, or you read Demosthenes' attacks on Philip, or just what Thucydides says about human nature, they're not thinking, oh my gosh, I judged this group, or I said something that this person could take as illiberal, or I said something about women, or I said something about the aristocracy that they don't really care. They're empirical. They try to capture the world as they see it and then let you deal with whether it's nice or not.
You mentioned Antigone. I can't help reflecting that that's a play, and several other ones, which have been adapted by modern playwrights. The most celebrated adaptation, I think, is by the French playwright Jean Anouilh, who presented it in Paris in 1944 under the Nazi occupation. It carried on through the end of the occupation, and I think played on until 1948, and then went to Broadway. That's, I think, a powerful adaptation. There are differences between him and Sophocles, but still it's powerful. And that means until 1948 at least, and sometime after that, we in the West understood and grasped there was a common thread from their world to ours, which with only minor adaptations made perfect sense and I would say illuminated moral conflicts in all our hearts. Any comment on that play?
That was a reassuring fact that when we were forced with authoritarian governments that were not moral but had the power to issue edicts and enforce them, or when we were captives of particular biases based on gender or ethnic affiliations, we could go to these texts and see a discussion of them. And so we were reassured that we were not, it was both reassuring and humbling, because I think part of the problem with modern society when you don't know these texts is you think you get up in the morning and discovered something new, and you haven't. And then it's reassuring in the sense you can go back and find people who probably were more brighter than you were because they weren't bothered with all this clutter of technology and ideology. It was more empirical, and they looked at, and they have answers. And then finally, they saw the world as sort of delineated or limited, and there was only 30 or 40 or 100 ideas that they went over and over: the individual and society, birth versus merit, what causes wars, how do you end them? And these main issues were sort of discussed again and again in different genres: comedy, drama, oratory, rhetoric, epic. Whereas today, we think that the world is amorphous and it's just out there limitless, and we're going to try to absorb it. We can't. And so we don't have anybody who tells us in universities there's only about 15 or 20 or 30 great questions that you all have to deal with in your life, and we're going to explore them with these. And instead, somebody comes up. I think the best-selling is How White People Should Talk right now, a book on white racism, and I just looked a little bit at it, and it has no no awareness of that issue throughout 2,500 years of learned examination.
As a matter of fact, you wrote a book called Who Killed Homer? And on the demise of classical education. When I was still at the sixth form at school, a lot of universities had serious classical departments. They mostly disappeared. In recent years, not everywhere. What happened to produce this? And maybe our culture wars are as bad as they are because, in a sense, we've taken away a substratum of understanding which we derive from being aware of the Bible and being aware of the classical authors.
Yeah. Well, I think that book was written and co-authored with John Heath in the 90s during the Reagan and Elder Bush wars. And I think everybody thought they had survived the tsunami, the Bill Bennett and Bellow and et cetera, et cetera. But I think no one in their right mind saw that it was a dormant volcano and it would explode 20 years later in much worse fashion. And so the point in that book was that the classics and indeed learning in the university was threatened at two ends. One was Manderism, that we had created this narrower and narrower and narrow specialization that was evident in publication and so-called peer review, and we were getting experts who felt they were safer and more authoritative the more and more esoteric they became, because their turf was smaller and they could master it all. And that was turning off students because they had no ability to relate to the real world. And I would find that out when I was interviewing professors to teach to mostly poor kids. I would say things like, how far is Sparta from Athens? And why do you think the Mycenaean world fell? And what's the difference between the Parthenon and the Temple of Hephaestus? They had no answer. They always wanted to get back to their thesis, which they cared about. And that thesis was such a nature that it wouldn't allow enrichment in other areas. And then the other one was, of course, ideology. And there was a sense that if you were going to be relevant, rather than to appeal in a populist fashion to people who were unaware of the classics and could benefit it, it was you were going to get in the race, class, and gender. And the irony was that you were going to be progressive and left-wing, but you would adopt an obscurantism, a Foucauldian vocabulary that made you an elite. And that's what it was all about. It was just the mirror image of the old standard narrow philologist, but with a new jargon posing as if you were left wing. That we predicted that the whole field would probably implode 20 years ago, more than 22 years ago. I think it has. Enrollments are way down. The departments are being disappearing, and then the main schools, they've disappeared in the sense that they no longer. If I were to interview a PhD in classics from Harvard or Yale, I would give him a Greek and Latin test before I'd allow him to teach, because I have a feeling that he wouldn't be able to pass it. Because if you look at the curriculum, it's the rhetoric of gender and the cult of transgender ISIS and stuff like that, that takes away critical hours that are necessary to master history, philology, epigraphy, numismatics, all those old disciplines. And that's tragic. And so a lot of us feel, I mean, we wrote that to warn people that we not be correct. And I think now I can't even pick up the book. I just feel like it's kind of depressing.
But there are cases, of course, of schools which have made a tremendous effort to revive I'm talking of schools here, high schools, as much as universities, maybe more so, tried to take poor kids in and give them a thorough grounding in the classics. And I mean, I have an unanchored, not particularly logical feeling that that's a very, very good thing. Although, how can I possibly justify that, and how can you justify it when it doesn't seem to lead to any great success in life, or most of them presumably will not have an interest sufficient to become serious scholars?
Well, I think and I think we mentioned at the end of the book that if it was to survive, it had to be carried on in almost a resistance fashion or underground fashion. So the homeschooling movement was very important. A college like Hillsdale, where I teach a month for the last 15 years, I think they have 6 class assistants in that small college of 1,300 students. So there's places, islands in the stream that deliberately try to be contrarian to the movement because they feel that they can incult better, in a better fashion, students, and then these students will be force multipliers of traditionalism because they're better educated. And it is true that when I see students at Stanford that come and talk to you at the Hoover institutions, the ones that have traditional majors in literature or philosophy or language or history tend to be much better educated, whatever their ideology is, than the hyphen studies people, the environmental studies, the black studies, gender studies, the conflict studies, the peace studies. Those studies, therapeutic educations and curriculums don't give you the basic skills of logic, grammar, oral and spoken and written fluency. So there's fewer well-educated people, but there are some very well-educated young people, and that's why I think there is a traditional or conservative movement today when, in theory, there should not be, because they do not have access to Hollywood, entertainment, music, the media, foundations, the university, all of the traditional organs of expression and cultural exposition and all that are controlled by the left. And yet there is still a vibrant conservative answer to that. And I think it's because these people in that movement have been better educated.
There's something interesting there. You probably know this quote, but Paul Getty, the great oil investor, was once asked why he employed so many classics graduates. And he said very simply, they sell oil. And he didn't quite know why, but they did. Before we leave this, though, I'd like to talk a bit about your book, Carnage and Culture. What was it about the West that enabled us to survive when, after all, the Greeks and Romans inhabited a small archipelago on the edge of Asia, and none of the, and although obviously there were some successes and some natural advantages, we didn't seem to have much of a hope against the great civilizations of Asia when we go back to the time of the birth of Christ.
Yes. In that book, I try to suggest that some of the hallmarks of Western civilization, dissent, the chauvinism of a middle class that manifested in infantry, protection of private property, constitutional government, rationalism, the idea of looking at science without the blinkers necessarily of religion that could be oppressive to scientific inquiry, free expression. I listed 15 or 16 things that when they applied to the battlefield, whether that would be manifested in sophisticated weaponry or close discipline or leadership that was accountable to political and authorities, but also to the rank and file, or logistics, the ability to sail from Barcelona to Mexico City rather than the Aztecs going into Barcelona from Mexico City. All of that gave the West an edge. It didn't mean that they could win all the time, because usually, whether they were in the New World or in Africa or against the forces of Islam, they were outnumbered. Often they were trisected with religious factionalism, orthodoxy, Catholicism, Protestantism. The European continent was always fighting West against West. But it did mean that they didn't have to have a Napoleon, or they didn't have to have an Alexander the Great, or they didn't have to have just a superior weapon like Greek fire, but they had a system of logistics and discipline and leadership and empiricism that would allow them, all things being equal, they would win. And I think a lot of people got very angry at the time I wrote it, but I think the story of the West, its ability to dominate culture of the planet and to implant its civilization throughout the world, kind of bears that out. Most of the historians that were critical said, well, this didn't start to the 18th century, or it didn't start to the Industrial Revolution, and look at Islam. But I think it, as you pointed out, if you look at places like Thermopylae, the last stand that lasted for 3 days, or the victories at Plataea or Salamis, or what Alexander the Great did, or Caesar, and even in the Crusades, there was always an ability to project power, not always rational power or moral power, but military power beyond their homelands in a way that reflected a dynamism that wasn't predicated on a particular inspirational leader.
I think there was also the ability to convert people to wanting to be like yourself. It wasn't all founded on conquest and slavery, that has become truer as the West has got older. It's been able to win people over to wanting to be, in some sense or other, Western.
I think that's why Islam especially is so angry at the West, because they see it as insidious, because we don't have those hierarchies. And whether it's our popular fashion or Levi's or familiarity between the sexes or music, when you go to the Arab world, you see that that's very attractive to people in a more repressive society. And that's absolutely true. And I'm reminded of a lot of passages in Caesar's Gallic War where tribes people come, and you can see it in a lot of Plutarch's lives too, of Roman conquerors, where they're told that they will have the benefits of habeas corpus, or their kids will wear purple togas and be in local senates, and they might even be able to go to Rome. And then, of course, by the 2nd century, most of the Roman emperors are not Italian. They're Spanish or North African. So I guess my point is that it's a very insidious culture, and that reinvents itself irrespective necessarily of race or hierarchy. And a lot of opposing systems find that very incendiary. It can be very corrupting too if it's not disciplined, because as we see on the streets, in one sense, these protests are multiracial, they're multicultural, they're informal, some of them are spontaneous, some are not, but some of them are anarchical and Lord of the Flies destructive.
Yes. Before I leave this topic, I'd like to ask where you would put in this history of the West the cities Paris, London, and Philadelphia, and which important city have I left out of that list?
Those are the inheritors of, I guess we would say, Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem. And by that I mean they were all the beneficiaries of that welding in the ancient world of Athenian genius and spontaneity and the city-state's constitutional government, but an impractical system that had no uniformity or no word in the vocabulary like natio or nation. And then a Roman consensual government that tried to include popular expression, but not in a demagogic fashion. And that was solved through a tripartite. The idea came from the Greeks, but it was not implemented widely, of a legislative, executive, and judicial branch that had a buffer between the people. And that's where we get to Philadelphia and Paris and London. I think all of those enlightenments saw that maybe with less residents in Paris, given the nature of 1793 to 4, but nonetheless, they did see that the Athenian model was not going to be practicable of democracy, and there had to be a constitutional republican model. And then there was this idea that Christianity could be incorporated and enriched by classical learning, because there was an impoverishment, at least not enough evidence in the Gospels or the original words of Christ to formulate a systematic and successful church. So when the church turned to questions of what happens when you die and you were not baptized, or how many sins does it take to go to hell, and can you be forgiven? All of these practical questions were not in the original doxology, so they turned to Neoplatonism and Aristotelian thought to combine Christianity with classicism, and that's manifested in all three of those cities. But I think the big difference is, just to finish, there is a line between London and Philadelphia and what became Washington that's somewhat separate from France and Paris, and that's highlighted by the vast difference between the Scottish and British Enlightenment, what Burke said about the French Revolution, what our founding fathers would later say a decade later about France. And the difference, I think, as they saw it, was that the British and Anglo-American tradition was an equality of opportunity, of chance, and then the resulting inequality would be natural, but it could be ameliorated by charity, philanthropy, government here and there. Whereas the French Revolution, like what we're seeing today in the United States, was systematic, totalitarian. We were going to ensure a equality, a fraternity, egalitarianism of result, and that would require a degree of coercion, death, destruction, violence for the unwilling. And that was the French model, and that's still there in some ways that we see in continental Europe in a way that's much different than in the British domains, the former Commonwealth, and the United States.
Let me now ask you about switch from the past to the present and to America. My impression is that the American educated class wants to erase history and start again. Why do you and I'm not just applying that to the left wing of it. There's substantial elements on the right, I think, that would like to do the same. And I wonder where that impulse comes from.
Well, I think what happens, I think Tocqueville talked about it, is that the more a society that's constitutional and Western becomes leisured, affluent, and closer to its goals of eliminating, let's say, inequality, the more that it gets obsessed with equality. And the more that it's free, the more that it feels it's unfree. So what we're seeing is not looting of beans and rice and staples, it's Adidas and Louis Vuitton bags. And what we're seeing are not people that are going up in the Maquis in the Sierra or the Rockies to fight out the revolution. They're these very snarky young kids that get up into, as you say, into policemen's face and yell, and then when they're arrested, they sound like stuck pigs. Oh my God, this can't be happening to me. It's not fair. How dare you? He yelled. So it's a sense that we've never made more progress of racial equality and of economic justice, and the closer we get to this ideal of the founding fathers and see it reified, the more people get impatient and angry that it's not perfect. And so we've got this idea on the left, we have to be perfect or we're no good at all. And so we go back now with every good man and woman of the past, and we only concentrate on their bad side, not their good. And there's no sense that Jefferson has a long ledger of wonderful things, from the Declaration of Independence to founding the University of Virginia, to his philosophical thought, to his practical emphasis on a Bill of Rights, but we just talk about slaves. And we never say there were thousands of slave owners south of the Mason-Dixon line, but there were very few that were like Jefferson. And so I don't know how, it's an unstable situation because nobody can be perfect. And you're already seeing, as we saw in the French Reign of Terror and we saw in the Cultural Revolution in China, what burns these fits of madness out is they start to get too close to home. So we see a man who's a Black Lives Matter advocate, a lawyer on the left, and now he's out with an AR-15 in St. Louis because they're coming after him. Or we see this Seattle occupation zone, and suddenly people are being killed and they're complaining that the police didn't get somebody out there in time, even though their directive is that there should be no police. So when that starts to endanger the middle class so that a liberal soccer mom calls 911 and gets a busy signal, or Dan Abrams, who has a reality TV show about police, cops, and a big critic of Trump during the Russian collusion hoax, when they cancel his show, or when they say to liberals who are very proud of their PhD from the Woodrow Wilson School, and suddenly they have no Woodrow Wilson School pedigree, that gets close to home. And then that person will say to the revolution, well, there is a Wilson Bridge, and there's a Wilson Center in Washington, and there's a Wilson, are you going to do this? Or, hey, Stanford, you just sent us a big letter about our illiberality, but Leland Stanford, who funded the university, used Asian labor in a very callous fashion to build the fortune that was dedicated to his son's name. Are you going to change Stanford? And then they start to draw back. It's easy to change Father Sarah's name, but not so much Stanford. But the logic insists that you do that. And it'll start to burn out. The question with all these things, we know that they're minority populations, but that doesn't mean they fail. The Bolsheviks were successful. It requires everybody, according to their station, to say that's absurd, stop that. And a lot of people are in this for their careers. They're trying to get rid of a superior. They have personal grudges. And we can't go into a say-them witch trial-like mentality. But to do that requires a lot of people to be fired and to lose their jobs. And we all have these rationalizations, you know. So many people will say, well, I would write back to the president, or I would object to my chairman, or I'd write an op-ed. But, you know, I'm supporting my nephew, and I have a sister-in-law who's got a very illness that I help, and if I lose my job, and that's understandable, but it takes people to call their bluff because they are a minority.
So what are we witnessing at the moment? Is it, on the one hand, a kind of spreading anarchy without a logic, or is it a kind of revolutionary choice between, on the one hand, the America of the 1788 Constitution with its freedoms and its Bill of Rights, and the recognition of the idea of Americans as being independent people, self-reliant, who live under the law. On the other hand, is it going to be a constitution imposed on us as a result of these changes, in which what you have is a kind of an interventionist government of a quasi-socialist kind, which in a sense regulates economic and other relations between different groups of Americans, defined racially perhaps, or sexually, or whatever. They seem to me to be two different things: the anarchy, or so to speak, the choice of moving to a new America. How do you see it?
I think they're not antithetical, but they're complementary. I see the Lord of the Flies anarchy as the means to obtain the goal that you articulated. And that goal you articulated is very well known among the foundations and the university departments and the corporate world. And a lot of those people want to see an America that is an equality of result, more like a radical form of the EU or France in the 18th century. But the actual foot soldiers, the looters, the burners, the arson, they're just turned loose and told generically that any person of the past who's white or male or Christian is fair game and tear him down. And then out of that chaos, the people who feel that when the revolution is over, when Joe Biden is elected, because that's the immediate objective, is to get rid of Trump and get Joe Biden across the finish line, even if you have to carry him across. And then there will be a 1944 swap, as we saw with Truman and Henry Wallace, when everyone knew Roosevelt would not last more than 3 months. And then we get in that hardcore, progressive, very articulated AOC type of agenda through a vice presidency. And that is, we all know what it is. It's packing the court, getting rid of the Electoral College, maybe redefining the Senate to be proportionally represented, the New Green Deal, reparations, wealth tax, abolishing ICE, open board, the whole thing. But the actual foot soldier is more into the carnival and the violence and being young and attacking signs of authority. And they're being used. There's no doubt about it.
I have a number of questions I'd like to pursue you on this. Some people, I mean, first of all, the nature of the revolution. I mean, what we see now is a development that is the climax of 20 to 30 to 40 years of ideas being spread via the universities, in the universities, of a very critical kind. Those ideas were, so to speak, manufactured. I could give you a list of them, such things as race is anything that anybody perceives as race. White people can't, the only people who can be racist because they're the only people with power. Any differences between groups have got to be the result of discrimination rather than differences of taste and aptitudes and so on. We could go down the list. But those are the ideas that spread through the universities and into the rest of society. The graduates who are woke are now at middle level, maybe higher positions in corporate America. How come all of this happened under our radar? Or let me put it another way, how come it happened despite the fact that some people, I would say you were one of them, I think I was another, were warning about this, and yet our political leaders, the ones we sympathize with, either didn't see it, but certainly didn't do anything about it?
I think that after the war with the GI Bill and the vast expansion, I mean, California's expanded, had the largest university system in the world, 23 campuses, the California State University, 300,000 plus students. The idea was that if you credentialed somebody and you subsidized that, then you were going to get an educated population, the great books idea, we're all going to be educated. But what we didn't see is that there was nobility in vocational training, and you could read and you could be an autodidact and mechanic or a welder, and that you could have expertise, and that should be well compensated. But we glorified this credentialing process and confused it with education. So you got a BA, but we never said, we always said, we're going to quantify your admission with SAT. We're going to be scientific and meritocratic, but we never said after 4 years, we'll give you an exit SAT test to see if you learned anything. Because then all of a sudden we were told you can't do that because that would be arbitrary in a way that it wouldn't to select people to go into the university. And so I think what happened was we started to expand this population, and we got into areas that were not academic, humane areas. There were philosophy, biology, mathematics, physics, foreign languages suddenly became a vocation. So all of a sudden it was theories of nursing or theories of business management. All of these could have been done in other venues. They always had been. We could have had trade schools, we could have had professional schools that were not connected directly with the university. And so those people within the university outnumbered the academics. And then the admissions the idea was, well, because you get branded with a Yale or Harvard like a cow, and that opens paths each ways, and that hierarchy works down to places where I taught, Fresno State. If you get a Cal State degree and you live in Selma, California, you can be eligible for these great jobs. You won't have to get dirty, you'll get a good retirement, you can stay in an air-conditioned office. The problem was that we let in all these people from non-traditional groups, and we didn't really start in K through 12 to prepare them. They got there, and I can remember the date. It was somewhere in the middle 80s when I was teaching, and I realized, I looked at my class of humanities of the Western world, and out of 50 people, I would say 20 could not read. And they were all of groups that if I said that they couldn't read, I would be fired. So when I started to give Ds, I would get people from the admissions or the equal opportunity offices call me and say, hey, Victor, this guy's the first guy in his family to go to school. You just gave him a D. If you flunk out, his whole world is, you've got to help us. And what do you want to do? Turn out a bunch of white and Asian graduates only? So we had people that we were trying to incorporate. And so what I would do is, I used to start with Homer, Iliad, Virgil, Aeneid, maybe Euripides, Bacchae, or Medea. Then I'd go to Thucydides, Herodotus, and then into Livy, and then that was the first part of the ancient humanities course, then Renaissance. And I found out people could not read it. So I would have people come in, and I'd say, would you read out loud the first page of the Iliad? And I would time them, and that would take them an hour to read 40 lines, because every word, I can remember one person says, what is a buckler? I have no idea what a buckler is. And then 4 years later, they had no idea what a shield was. And then 4 years later, they didn't know what protection was. And so then to accommodate that new group, we had to come up with this idea that there was endemic racism that you mentioned, there was endemic sexism, there was endemic isms and ologies everywhere, and that had prevented or retarded the advance of people who otherwise would have made it. So then we started getting these indoctrination videos, 3 hours, 6 hours, 9 hours, to teach you what words you could not say. It was all built on the idea that a large group of students felt that they were unhappy and they were angry because they had been given an opportunity, they had been given money, they had been given an admission, but they hadn't been given the preparation. And therefore, by any standard, they were not doing as well as a kid from Atherton that went to prep school, or the immigrant from China whose parents were making him study 6 hours a day. And they had to come up with an exegesis, and all of these academics gave them one, that everybody was guilty of microaggressions and systemic racism, and there we are. That's where we are today. So the university should have been much smaller, and vocational education should not just have been expanded, but its reputation should have been enhanced, so that we in a society, when we're stuck on the side of the road and a guy comes and fixes our car, or we're in a quarantine in Manhattan and out of nowhere a guy comes with a new washing machine and knows how to wire it, that's a very impressive, well-compensated skill deserving of respect, in a way that one of these whiny protesters as a lecture in philosophy maybe not. But once you consider this credentialing as an entree into success, then that's what started it.
Now, let me now ask this question, because you wrote, you're one of the few academics and public intellectuals who's taken a strong position in defense of Donald Trump. You supported him. Do you see Donald Trump as a response to the situation you've just described in the large social sense? Or is this situation, the revolution now, a response to him? What role does he play between these two events?
Well, if he didn't exist, I guess the answer would be he'd have to be created, because he did two things that got him nominated and winning the Electoral College. And one of them was the issues, and one of them was the delivery system. The issues were, we had an open border, and that was driving down. We had 50 million people who were not born in the United States, probably 20 million here illegally, and that was driving down wages for the industrial belt of the United States, in between the two coasts. Then we had an asymmetrical situation with China, in which the attitude of Washington was, they're going to win anyway, we might as well profit with them before they get hegemony, and forget outsourcing and offshore. That doesn't bother us. We're living in Manhattan, we're living in Atherton. And then the other issue was, we were involved in the Middle East, and I supported the Iraq War, I think a lot of people did, but Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and our elite could not tell us in a cost-benefit analysis that all the blood and treasure was worth regional stability or U.S. interest. We weren't achieving either. And so that was the third signature issue, along with the border and trade. And then finally he said, Larry Summers and Obama are wrong. We can reindustrialize the United States. It was done by other people or our own elites. But we have cheap electricity, we have a good infrastructure, we have a good workforce. Why can't we build things and not the Europeans or the Japanese? And so that issue, they were there, and he harvested that discontent. The other side of the equation, of course, was he said, essentially, both explicitly and by inference, you guys haven't won 51% since George H.W. Bush did it in 81. You've lost 5 out of the 6 popular votes. I may not win the popular vote, but I will win in a way that Romney lost, Dole lost, McCain lost, George W. Bush lost the popular vote. The last time they won was really when they unleashed that rather uncouth Lee Atwater. You remember him?
I do.
And then we had the Boston Tea Party commercial, the tank commercial, the Willie Horton. And the idea was, I'd rather win ugly than lose nobly. And so the Democrats kept calling these Republican gentleman candidates racist, illiberal, throw granny off the cliff, put your dog on top of your car, and they didn't reply. And the locus classicus was Mitt Romney in that 2012 debate with Candy Crawley, when she hijacked the question and became a partisan. And we wanted a Reagan moment when he grabbed the microphone and said, how dare you? But he didn't. And so Trump came along and said, you may not like me, but I'm going to give it back double what you've been taking. for these, and we're not going to have any Bob Dole, no McCain, no Romney, that we're not going to reply in kind. When they attack me, I'm going to reply with megatonnage. And that was an appealing message, at least it has been for 4 years. So it was a methodology, was a response to previous events, and the ideology was as well. He didn't create that on its own. That's why it's so dangerous for the left and for the Republican establishment, because they think they can get rid of Trump and then that will disappear, but it won't. Because people want somebody to defend the United States and its traditions, no matter how callous he has to be. They prefer he be polite, but they understand that politeness cannot be effective sometimes, and then they want these issues addressed, Trump or no Trump.
Now, looking at Trump's revolution, and in some respects he wasn't the best man to do it. You might have had a more eloquent person who was able to, in a sense, lay out the arguments for what he was doing more effectively, although he did have a unique and effective way of addressing the American people. But do you see what he's doing here reflected in any way in Europe, in Brexit Britain with Boris, in Hungary with Orban, in Poland with the Law and Justice Party? Because, of course, a lot of people on the left in America would say that, and some people would say it in Europe as well. Are these distinct phenomena, or are they similar outbreaks of the same kind of reaction?
No, I think they're similar. I think Trump understands Europe because he's not an internationalist or globalist. He tries to make sense of it in terms of his own political calculus. And what he sees in Europe is a socialist utopia that doesn't work and that is a synonym for German power and hegemony. And he thinks that Eastern Europe is dictated to from Germany on illegal immigration and culture, and Southern Europe is dictated on matters of finance, and Britain is lectured on matters of Brexit, and we're lectured on matters of NATO contributions. And that's basically a synonym for Germany. And that's why Germans hate him so much, and he is not fond of Germany. That's one thing. The other thing is that when he looks at Europe, he supports constitutional government, but he believes that the only alternative to Putin or to the Chinese is a confidence in Western traditions. And because of this, it's kind of an Aeschylean idea of pathemathos, with learning comes through pain. And he looks at Eastern Europe and he sees that they were the blood grounds of World War II, both from the Germans and the Russians, and then the communist tragedy, and that they did not have the luxury of experimenting with this sort of social revolutions and license that was apparent. And he wasn't the first to do that. Remember, Donald Rumsfeld calls a storm when he used the term Old Europe and New Europe. Old Europe was more like us, he said. New Europe was not. And so Trump looks at the country, Hungary and Poland and the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, and some of the Balkans, no doubt. And he gets terribly criticized because they don't have the freewheeling cultures and democracies, perhaps, as the West. But he says these are the only people who are custodians of religion, of order, of tradition, of custom, and they're better representations of Western civilization, despite their occasional authoritarianism, than these other people who are selling out their own legacy for contemporary and fleeting advantage. So yeah, he and his supporters seem to do that. It's very difficult, as you know, to make that argument because you're hit in the United States with it. You're a racist and alt-right, Victor Orban aficionado, all of that. So it's difficult, but I think he's been very good doing it.
Well, a final question, Victor. I think we both agree that we're in the middle of a very serious crisis. We can't see exactly where it's going to end up. But there are two elements, therefore. Is Donald Trump dropping the ball? Is he making mistakes at the moment that will lose him the election? How can he set that right? And on the other side, if he does indeed lose the election, can you offer conservatives and traditionalists any kind of hope for an America introduced under a Biden administration?
Well, to answer your first question, he's about where he was on election day, or I should say at this point in 2016, about 10 to 12 down, and he closed to 2 down. And he's ironically right where Obama was as far as popularity in June, at least, not July, but June of 2012, when Romney was polling much higher and Obama. So I'm not too worried at this early date about the polls. His dilemma is this, though. He had this booming economy, and that was a recovery from impeachment. And impeachment was a recovery from Ukraine, and Ukraine was a recovery from Mueller, and he recovered from Mueller 25th Amendment. And what he sees is, like a cartoon character, Roadrunner, he always gets out of the clutches of these psychodramas. So when this started and the economy tanked, he said, well, the virus did it, but I'll get out. And then remember that he was up to 50 in the Gallup poll just 6 weeks ago, because he had Fauci here and Birx here, and he looked like he was in control of the economy, his forte. And then the looting started and the riots, and he was slow to react because his advisors said this is a no-go zone. And the problem was that when he did start to react and see that it was this unsustainable violence, he was in a dilemma that he didn't realize that he was in. And by that I mean this was the first riot in my experience, looting, mass panic, where the police chief of Seattle, the mayor of Minneapolis, the governor of New York was on the side of the protest. And they were warning the president, if you bring in federal troops in the manner that George H.W. Bush did to quell the violence after Rodney King in LA, and Colin Powell, chairman, was very happy to do that, we will resist. And so the advisor said, you know what, you do not want to send a federal 101st in there and get in a fight with, that was unprecedented. And then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs basically said, I won't do a photo op with you, it's political. We've never had that. That's what Joint Chiefs do. They're used by presidents for good or bad, they do it all. Colin Powell was a past master. But 4 of them came out and not only said that was wrong, but said it in such a way that Joe Biden said that they would be on his side if he wanted to remove Trump, if Trump supposedly wouldn't leave. And then we had 12 of the most esteemed admirals and generals come out, and that was unprecedented. It was contrary to the Code of Military Justice, Article 82, and they said he was Mussolini. They said that he should be gone sooner and better. They said there was a very small number of violent protests. They said all of these crazy things. And the result of all that was he said, wait a minute, I will substitute what needs to be done, and I can't do it because I can't trust the military and I can't trust the blue states, so I will do it rhetorically. That was a bad mistake. So what did he do? He said, I'm going to clean up Seattle. They better watch out in Minneapolis because that's unsustainable. And everybody's on his base, and the swing voters said, make it all go away. And he's not making it all go away. He's just talking about it. And I want it all to go away. And I will vote for Trump if he makes it all go away. But if he doesn't, I'm going to get in a fetal position and go like this and say, go away. And maybe if I vote for Biden, he'll appease them and they'll just say he's one of ours, so they'll stop. And that's where he is. I think after he realized that, now what he's doing, he's trying to get Barr on one side and maybe Cuccinelli and maybe his national security is going to, I hear he's going to start giving press conferences like he did with the COVID and address the nation and say, here are my limitations, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to indict the SOBs that caused the violence. Barr has 100 indicted today, 200 tomorrow. He's going to say, we are controlling the border. He's going to say, if those states will not follow federal law and state law, they're not going to get federal funds from me, and cut them off. He said, there's a monument that's a federal monument. I can protect it. California cannot lock down Yosemite. That's a federal park. It's not a state jurisdiction. So he can do things that give people the confidence that as this thing naturally, I think it's going to naturally burn out, that he's in control. But he hasn't done that yet. And the result is that he's not captured the swing voter. And he's actually lost, I think the untold story, he's lost 2 to 3% in his base. Because I've had so many people call me and say, if I'm going to go out on a limb for this guy at a cocktail party, or if I'm at work, then damn it, I want I want him to go out and do something. I don't want to see any more tweets. I don't want to see Joe Scarborough tweets. I don't want to see any of this cul-de-sac stuff. I want him to stop it. And if he does that, he will get those 2 or 3 back and he'll win the swing voter. Let me just add one little coda. He can do that because the ship of state, the campaign, so to speak, with its sails, and that's the news cycle, he's had headwinds, lockdown virus, looting Mueller, impeachment. But now there is a change. There are tailwinds in the horizon. And by that, I mean the virus will wane. The economy is already starting to come back. Biden is non-compos mentis. He's not able to function, and he's running a stealth campaign, and they're going to have to bring him out, especially if those polls for Trump get up to 45, 44, then Biden will be forced to go out. If he's forced to go out, quite tragically, he's not going to be able. He came out yesterday, and he actually read the prompts as well as the answer to questions that were canned. It's not such a bad scenario. And if we had this conversation in October, I think they'd be neck and neck. If he were to lose, that is predicated on how you define loss. That is, if he can't regain the House as he loses the presidency, and they were to win the Senate, the first thing they do would be get rid of the filibuster. The second thing they would do would be to enlarge, and they could do it legislative. It's not in the Constitution. They would enlarge the Supreme Court to 12 or 16 justices and almost immediately pack that with liberals that would radically change the United States. The next thing they would do, it was probably, I think they have the votes in the states to eliminate the Electoral College. They would do that. I don't know whether they would be able to get the votes to eliminate 2 senators from Wyoming or Montana, in the sense that every senator will be proportionally voted. So California would get 30, maybe Montana would get 1, but they would try that. They would try structural changes to change what they feel is a rotten system. And I think the rest of us being depressed and seeing that the Republican establishment, the Never Trump group, many of our most distinguished voices have failed us, and the Trump movement failed, they would retreat into sort of a monastery of the mind. They would say to themselves, National Football League, they're all kneeling. The coach is kneeling. Turn it off. Music, I don't want to hear any more propaganda. Television, I can't take it anymore. I'm not going to go to the movies. Send my kid to Yale, or I can't do it anymore. And there would be a small rump state that would congregate either psychologically, mentally, or geographically into poles of resistance, sort of like the medieval period, waiting for French to come, or the Renaissance or something, because I'm very depressed about that possibility. I don't see the Republican elites. They gave us the argument that Trump was an aberration and that they were the sober and judicious custodians of conservatism, but this was their moment. They could have come out in the Senate and the House and said, we are not in the 244th year of this republic going to tear down Columbus or Washington or Jefferson or rename things as if, this is the French Revolution. But they've been quiet, except for Tom Cotton and a very few voices, Lindsey Graham, a few of them. But I don't know why they're scared, or they think they won't be reelected, or they think Trump is going to lose and take them down. But we don't have a political conservative establishment anymore. I mean, all the names, John, that you and I and others used to reference with relish, and we all got along with, and I'm talking about Jonah Goldberg or George Will or Bill Kristol or David Frum, or once in a while we would go to the Drudge Report. Whatever that venue is, the weekly, they either don't exist anymore or they've gone over to the other side. So there are no reference of the conservative movement. There are very few. That's when people in the White House, on occasion, I've talked to them on the phone, and I try to tell them, you're orphaned and you have to create your own institutions because they're not going to be there. They keep thinking that one day Bill Kristol's going to wake up to his senses and see that between Trump and anarchy, Trump is preferable, or the Drudge Report will suddenly go back to way. It's not going to happen. And they have very few venues, maybe 2. I even see in Fox News that they only have 2 or 3 Fox shows left that are conservative in the sense of supporting what Trump's trying to do. And then There's Rush Limbaugh and talk radio, and there is the genre of talk radio, but I don't see and a few foundations and organizations, but boy, I have to be very careful what I'm saying, but when I look at my own institutions, the Hoover institutions or AEI or Heritage, I don't see them in the old traditions of a young Tom Sowell, Robert Conquest, Milton Friedman, those people are not there anymore. And so it's a very lonely feeling. And, I feel like a constitutional Republican in France at around 1793, and we're all in line for the guillotine.
Or perhaps a Roman living in southern England at the time when the legions go home. No, I know that feeling very well. In fact, I've had it most of my life, but I think that I'm probably temperamentally a bit more optimistic than you in this. But because I do think that the problems on the right are the problems of an insurgent right, which has got to make its way in the world. As you say, it doesn't have the backing of the kind of leadership structures. In fact, they're enemies in many respects. But as a result of, unless those leadership structures develop their own followers, they're going to have to turn to our followers, so to speak. And we'll see what happens. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. It's ranged very widely. I'm very grateful for it. I hope events prove us both pessimistic and wrong. Thank you very much, Victor.
Still optimistic that he will win in the fall and that the majority of people would agree with us.
Well, I hope so too. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.